10 years ago now, one of the finest tricks that was ever pulled on me in a video game, which cemented my love of gaming for the past decade or so, in terms of its unique story potential, was Toby Fox lovingly ensuring that Undertale began by introducing you to a character you would regard as one of its most evil, unlikable characters, before then revealing in the very final chapter of its good ending that said character is actually one of the most heart-wrenching and lastingly endearing figures in the series. The true pacifist ending reveals Flowey, who is the first enemy to try and kill you, and tries to instill a brutal kill-or-be-killed ethos in you, in a game where you literally don't have to hurt anyone ever, is actually the remains of Azrael, the son of Toriel and Asgore, after he and his adoptive human sibling, who you resemble, tried and failed to save monsterkind from the underground. This is the final lesson about empathy the game has to teach you, as the pacifist run closes by showing you that this initially intentionally alienating and unpleasant entity is actually a deeply sympathetic figure who ultimately only wanted the best for everyone else. At risk of revealing I am, by internet measurements, approximately as old as an ancient wizard, I was young enough when Undertale released that I legitimately think this twist played a not inconsiderable role in me becoming an adult with the sometimes troublingly rare traits of things like, basic human compassion, having cemented the idea that you can't truly judge people by their outward appearance or behaviour, since most folks have much deeper lore than you can glimpse at first when they cut you off in traffic or are an evil plant or whatever. As a result, it's all the funnier that, all these years later, the quasi-sequel to Undertale absolutely got me, and many others, with the exact same trick flipped on its head, proving that time does not necessarily make anyone wiser, as I for one fell for Deltarune's clever story trick with Flowery, with all the tact and dignity of some sort of Tom and Jerry scene of a cartoon cat being hit with a frying pan. Better yet, Deltarune did so with its own version of the exact same character, since Flowery is very obviously a play on Undertale's Flowey, though with some very crucial changes, since Azrael already canonically exists as a separate figure in Deltarune, and since the vaguely romantic-esque implications of Flowery and Asgore's relationship means they very much are not father and son. No, instead Deltarune Chapter 5 reveals that Flowery is actually, legitimately, a flower. In fact, Flowery is one of the 7 special flowers that Asgore has been keeping alive in his tragic flower store turned bachelor pad turned sad man cave conspiracy shack, and his efforts to do so have earned the undying loyalty of his sentient shrubbery, meaning when Chapter 5's Flower Kingdom Dark World is constructed and they are given more movable forms, they immediately all commit to the task of trying to help the former police chief. Their efforts end up being less dedicated to helping Asgore find the culprit of the previous crimes that led to him losing his job and divorcing with Toriel though, which is what Asgore actively wants, and are far more about entertaining Asgore, keeping his attention, and replacing his previous life in a sense, perhaps owing to their original plant origins preventing them from having the life experience to understand why Asgore wouldn't be comfortable with them entirely new figures trying to replace, say, his children, even if he does seem to be something of a distant father for the most part to our protagonist Chris. That said, Chris isn't exactly the most talkative critter, especially after we appear to have possessed them to pilot them around like some weird Ratatouille mech hybrid, so I can't judge too harshly just yet. Chapter 5 does explicitly set its story up to judge one character very harshly from almost its first active story moments though, as the minute you stop having fun in the festival and enter the Dark World, you're treated to an introduction to Flowery that is, and I don't think I'm over-exaggerating by saying this, the most extra thing I've seen in my entire life. And I've played every Dark Souls game under the sun, so I like to think that's a pretty high bar. Flowery's intro itself effectively breaks the unofficial rules of Deltarune, since the pixel art style of the game temporarily gives way to a full, extremely detailed and dramatic feeling anime opening scene, showing us Flowery like he's a goddamn Persona character, and not a figure we'll generally see via an assortment of around 100 pixels or so grouped together. It's also quickly revealed that, unlike every other figure in the game thus far, Flowery has a range of fully voice-acted lines in his repertoire.
Leave it to me. Here I come, San Francisco!
Which consist almost exclusively of surreally weird catchphrases that are as funny as they are frankly bizarre to hear for the first time. Or really for any time after that. This all certainly creates a striking impression, to say the least, and one that makes Flowery an immediately divisive character, which is to say that most people develop an instinctive dislike or distrust of him, much in the way that animals instinctively know to be wary of brightly coloured poisonous frogs. Flowry's overly chipper nature, combined with his penchant for disregarding the concerns expressed by others, and his desire to pull the wool over Asgore's eyes about his own child trying to reach him before the Night can kidnap him, all make him an easy-to-side-eye character. Ironically, even though anyone who's played Undertale knows the original Flowey wasn't as evil as it first appeared, the fact we know Asriel is a separate character who exists in Deltarune already does initially suggest Flowey might be the equivalent of the more sinister side of Flowey that we first met in the 2016 game, since Flowey also has a wholehearted commitment to his own ethos and views on life that become a hurdle for us to navigate here as well. Flowey intentionally seeming to rile up Ralsei for no reason, and also focusing on Susie over Chris, which is a complex thing for the player to register, given how they may have just come from a version of the Fair Day wherein Chris is forced to third wheel Susie and Noelle and help them go on their first date, despite having ambiguously teased feelings for Susie, if not them both, only makes the matter of what the player thinks of him all the more likely to go south, given it further suggests that Flowey's kind outer nature is a thin veneer concealing the roots of his evil. It even makes thematic sense, since, plants. As we get further into Chapter 5, though, and we learn more about the rest of the flowers, this seems more and more of a questionable idea. The rest of the squad ranges from being entirely wholesome to absolutely ready to throw deadly weapons at you, sure, but none of them seem malicious in intent towards any of the party truly, even when they're actively in combat with you. On a similar level, though the exact manifestation of their efforts to protect Asgore vary, it's clear they all genuinely care for him, and are troubled that they don't seem to be able to help him even now they have more corporeal forms. After duking it out with all of the other plants, and maybe a secret 8th plant, if you're particularly inquisitive, you finally get to face down Flowey, and, given the difficulty of the fight, probably lose the battle at least once. At which point you notably don't get a death screen, as you do if you lose almost every other fight in the game. Instead, Flowey pops you down before the fight area and lets you go on your merry way, even though at this point it's already clear that he's the last line of defense between this world living or being undone. And it's been established that none of the flowers are able to go live in Castletown after being pacified and spared, due to the fragility of their real-world forms. This means Flowey literally is in a situation that is the kill or be killed scenario his Undertale doppelganger lives by, and he still refuses to take the lethal route out. Which is at least in part because he's leaning into the your dad's best friend bit, but also shows his efforts to help you have been in part genuine, and that he has a sense of compassion that arguably most people would not have to the same degree if they were in his leaf-shaped shoes. Flowey's efforts to help you navigate the level thanks to his 6 skateboard skills prevent you from being soft-locked and thus passively dealt with, and his words to Ralsei carefully advising him not to take the rules Ralsei has imposed on himself too carefully look to be genuinely well-intentioned. Indeed, it's notably advice that does make it seem as though Flowey knows his efforts to protect this world, and his only chance to actively be a person who can do things, won't last. Be that because the vegetative adventurer knew he wouldn't do active harm to Chris, Susie or Ralsei, and thus that they'd eventually defeat him, or because it suggested Flowey absolutely knows he's in a video game on some level, and that he doesn't really stand a chance compared to the player themselves and their infinite number of chances to try and beat Flowey, which they only need to do once. Altogether, by the end of Chapter 5, I and most players who also instinctively mistrusted Flowey all had to come to one shared conclusion. Namely, that any sus moments in the first leg of the chapter were custom-built to trick you into being suspicious of a genuinely kind character, and build the exact same scenario that was the case with Undertale all those years ago, where you realise in the final leg of this part of the story that actually the bright yellow flower maybe wasn't the true villain all along. Only this time, it's even easier to be entirely suspicious of the character, since an overly friendly persona may actually be more sketchy seeming than one that's clearly and transparently malicious for most of a game. With all this in mind, it also seems as though the final battle you get with Flowey is an effort to impart the character's lesson on the protagonists and player alike. Sort of like a kid's glove version of the infamous Sans genocide fight in the original Undertale itself too, with it being implied that Flowey could have finished Chris off in the final segment of the battle, but finds himself unable to land the blow due to his own compassion. In the same vein, Flowey sets up a scenario wherein Ralsei has to break his own rules in order for Chris and Susie to win the fight, allowing him to grow in this regard, and clearly knows something is up with Chris and doesn't trust them on a level that's understandable, since the character states he's watched Chris grow up and knows something has changed with them. Given Chris appears to have made this dark fountain in the first place with a limited moment of their free will, he certainly doesn't appear to be wrong. And it's worth noting that his repeated, insistent talk about the power of friendship may in fact be as much for Chris's sake as it is to match the anime protagonist style vibe he has going on overall. With this possibly being a call to Chris to trust in their friends and change their mindset, based on what we know of our dear, stone-faced pal's questionable behaviour thus far. And this would partly explain why I believe he heals you at the end of the fight too, and states the moment is a comedy and not a tragedy, since he also seems partly motivated by the idea of teaching the protagonist trio about morals and trusting in others in a similar way. Even Flowery's death shows that he's a genuinely good flower guy, as he notably sacrifices himself to try and protect Asgore from the night, and his dying words warn Susie and Chris about the dangers lurking beneath the town, adding another healthy bit of foreshadowing to whatever appears to be going on with the mysterious underground bunker we've been trying to get into for most of the game. Flowery's dying words see him also mention that he wishes he could have done more, and have him call himself useless, clearly frustrated by his lot when it comes to being a flower, and the semi-haunting reality of existing as a living being that can't really do much other than photosynthesize, which does underscore that his over-the-top way of doing just about anything is likely a consequence of him finally being able to do things for the first time, and thus going all in for the limited span of hours he got to be a flying, Gerona-saying, fully sentient life form. And you can't really blame him for that in any measure. Even if I did immediately turn his voice lines off when given the option to see what would happen and to give myself a moment of peace. Whether you've played Undertale or not though, Flowery is arguably Chapter 5's most interesting character, unless you're particularly into cowboys or catgirls, or both, since he ties most into the themes of freedom and what it means, as well as the theme of what it means to be good or evil, which both come up repeatedly from Deltarune's first moments onward. Of course, this happens in terms of the plot twist where the guy who seems way too nice to be a genuinely good person is shockingly revealed to be the exact kind of person it seemed they were pretending to be, but it also goes a lot deeper than that in my opinion. Flowery trying to take a non-lethal route, even outright referencing the term pacifist route, works strikingly well to provide the protagonist and player a different kind of challenge, as it's hard to not feel guilt about the fact that these lovely characters are doomed to lose their ability to do just about anything other than breathe because of us, even if our efforts to close the Dark Fountain here are well-intentioned and executed in order to try and protect the world from the danger that keeping it open would create. Similarly, Flowery appearing to be a being who is aware of the limits of the game's reality to the same degree Ralsei is, makes his decision to stand by Asgore and the other flowers all the more important, and makes Ralsei's arc in this part of the story particularly noteworthy, with Ralsei being the only person who seems to hate Flowery more than the player might for much of this leg of the journey, effectively because Flowery embraces some of the freedoms that Ralsei denies himself, as is evidenced when Ralsei uses a sneaky fragment of his power and shows us he's capable of way, way more than he lets on. From this perspective, Ralsei telling a dying Flowery that he didn't and doesn't need to be useful to be loved or cherished is a really important moment for both figures, since we've seen Ralsei deny himself a sense of worth, and deny himself any comfort that isn't directly associated with serving what he believes to be his purpose. Whereas Chapter 5 sees the character learn to let himself be a person with thoughts and emotions, and understand a little more that Chris and Susie care for him whether he's being useful or not, as is proven by them locking in to get him some furniture for his otherwise empty room. With Flowery also seeming to have taught Susie some interesting stuff about the nature of the universe, which I am almost as worried about as Ralsei, since the odds of this coming into play in one way or another in the next chapter seems pretty damn solid, all things considered. It's clear Flowery's impact on all of the main trio makes his story, and the twist he was really just your dad's best friend for the most part all along, a reveal that is set to pave the path for the future of the game in a major way. Even if that's just via all the other people who I'm sure now also have every single one of his damn catchphrases playing in their head 24/7 just like me. As is the eternal case, if you made it this far, a huge thanks for listening. After finishing Chapter 5, I got to the point where I had to stop telling all the people in my life who haven't played Deltarune about how a golden flower man was really interesting. No, really, come back. So I'm grateful as hell to you, fellow internet goer, for letting me rant on about how I essentially am no smarter when it comes to predicting story twists than I was a decade ago. And no smarter in most other regards too, really. I'd definitely be interested to hear your take on Flowery, and how Deltarune handles his arc of sorts in the comments below. Even if that's just to hear that you still hate him. which would be pretty fair still. I hope you're having a good morning, afternoon, or night when you hear this, and that you take the same level of emotional inspiration from Chapter 5's characters, by which I mean mainly this living volcano of chili, that I did, as we should all strive to channel this energy every day in my humble opinion.